Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. In the dim twilight of a war-torn landscape, Ella stood alone, her armor dented and smeared with blood, none of it her own. Around her, the cries of the dying mingled with the distant roar of battle, but her world had narrowed to the still forms lying before her. Her family, once the center of her universe, now lay scattered on the ground, lifeless and cold. Ella's heart clenched as she knelt beside her younger sister, Kara, whose bright blue eyes were now closed forever. For a long moment, she couldn't move. It was as if the life had drained out of her along with her loved ones. She wanted to scream, to tear at the heavens for the cruelty of it all, but her voice was caught in her throat. She had fought so hard, led her family into battle with the promise that they would survive together. But now, there was nothing left, no one left. The enemy, a horde of monstrous warriors led by the warlord Kargaz, had overrun their defenses. Despite Ella's skill, her relentless drive to protect those she loved, the enemy's numbers were too great. They had been merciless, cutting down her parents, her two brothers, and finally, Kara, who had stayed close to her side throughout the battle. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the battlefield in an eerie orange glow, Ella finally allowed herself to cry. The tears came in a torrent, spilling over the blood-streaked ground, mixing with the dirt and ashes of the dead. She wept until she had no more tears left, until her body ached from the effort of it. And when the tears stopped, a cold determination took their place. She would not let this be the end. She had heard whispers, ancient stories passed down in hushed tones, of a forbidden magic that could bring the dead back to life. It was dangerous, unnatural, but Ella didn't care. She couldn't imagine a world without her family. She would do anything to bring them back, no matter the cost. With newfound resolve, Ella rose to her feet, wiping the tears from her face with the back of her hand. The battlefield was silent now, the enemy having moved on, leaving behind only the dead and dying. She gathered what remained of her family, her mother's locket, her father's sword, the small wooden carving her brothers had made for Kara, and placed them carefully in a satchel. These items would be the anchors she needed for the ritual. Ella knew where she had to go. In the far north, beyond the cursed lands, lay the ruins of an ancient city, long abandoned and forgotten. It was said that the knowledge of the old sorcerers still lingered there, buried deep within the crumbling walls. If there was any place where she could find the spell she needed, it would be there. The journey was perilous, taking her through desolate landscapes where the sun rarely shone and the wind howled like a living thing. The air grew colder with each step, the trees twisted and gnarled as if poisoned by the land itself. She encountered creatures that should not exist, phantoms that whispered her name, shadowy figures that watched her from the edges of her vision, but she pressed on, driven by her singular purpose. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she reached the ancient city. It was a place of nightmares, the buildings shattered and leaning at impossible angles, the streets overgrown with blackened vines. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and an unnatural silence hung over everything. But Ella was not afraid. She had come too far to turn back now. In the heart of the city, she found it, the temple where the sorcerers had once practiced their dark arts. The doors, massive and ornately carved, creaked open as she pushed against them, revealing a vast chamber lit only by the faint glow of runes etched into the walls. At the center of the room was an altar, and upon it lay a book, its pages yellowed with age, the language inscribed upon them ancient and indecipherable to most, but not to Ella. As she approached the book, the runes on the walls flared to life, casting the room in a sickly green light. The words on the pages seemed to shift and writhe, as if alive, but Ella could read them as clearly as if they had been written in her native tongue. The spell she sought was there, detailed and chilling precision. The instructions were clear, but the warnings were even clearer. The magic required was not just dark, it was forbidden for a reason. It required a sacrifice, a part of herself, to bring back the dead. And even then, the results were unpredictable. The dead were not meant to return to the world of the living, and those who did would not be the same as they once were. Ella hesitated only for a moment before she began the preparations. She placed the items she had brought on the altar, the locket, the sword, the carving, and began to chant the incantation written in the book. The air around her grew heavy, oppressive, as if the very fabric of reality was being stretched and twisted. Her voice grew louder, more desperate, as she felt the magic take hold. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and a cold wind whipped through the chamber, extinguishing the runes on the walls. The darkness closed in, but Ella continued, her voice now echoing in the black void. She could feel the magic tearing at her, drawing out a piece of her soul, but she did not stop. She couldn't stop. Not now. With a final, agonized scream, the spell was complete. The air stilled, the ground ceased its trembling, and the oppressive weight lifted. Ella collapsed to her knees, exhausted, her breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no movement, just the suffocating silence of the chamber, and then, from the darkness, she heard it, a voice, weak and distant, calling her name. Ella's heart leapt in her chest as she scrambled to her feet, her eyes searching the shadows. Slowly, the figures of her family emerged, stepping into the dim light of the chamber, but something was wrong. The moment she saw them, Ella knew. Their eyes, once filled with warmth and love, were now empty, hollow. Their movements were stiff, unnatural, as if they were marionettes being controlled by invisible strings. And they did not speak, not with words, anyway. They only made guttural, inhuman sounds that sent a chill down Ella's spine. She reached out to them, her heart breaking at the sight of what she had done. Her mother, her father, her brothers, and Kara, they were all there, but they were not the same. They were shells of their former selves, their souls twisted by the dark magic she had used to bring them back. Mother. Father. Ella's voice trembled as she approached them, but they did not respond. They only stared at her with those empty eyes, their faces devoid of any recognition. Despair clawed at her as she realized the true horror of her actions. She had not brought her family back, she had trapped their souls in this twisted, unnatural state. And now, they were suffering because of her selfishness. Over the next few days, Ella tried everything she could to reverse the spell, to free her family from the torment she had condemned them to. But nothing worked. The more she tried, the worse they became. Their bodies began to decay, the rot spreading like a poison through their flesh, and their minds, what little remained of them, began to fray, unraveling into madness. The villagers, once her friends and allies, soon turned against her. They whispered of witchcraft, of curses, and began to shun her, their fear and suspicion growing with each passing day. Some even spoke of driving her out, of burning her at the stake as a witch. But Ella did not care about them, her only concern was her family. The guilt gnawed at her, a constant, unrelenting ache in her chest. She could not sleep, could not eat, could not think of anything but the nightmare she had unleashed. She was haunted by the memories of her family as they had been, full of life, love, and laughter, and the reality of what they had become. It was during one of these sleepless nights, as she sat by the cold hearth, staring into the dying embers, that she realized what she had to do. She could no longer bear to see her family suffer, to see them trapped in this horrific limbo between life and death. She had to free them, even if it meant destroying the very being she had fought so hard to bring back. The next morning, she set out to find the elder, a wise woman who lived in the mountains and was known for her knowledge of the old ways. The journey was long and treacherous, but Ella did not falter. She had made her decision, and nothing would stop her from seeing it through. The elder's home was a small, unassuming hut nestled among the trees, but there was an air of power about it that made Ella hesitate at the door. Taking a deep breath, she knocked, and the door creaked open on its own. Inside, the elder sat by a fire, her eyes closed as if in deep meditation. She was old, far older than anyone Ella had ever seen, with hair as white as snow and skin like parchment. When she finally opened her eyes, they were sharp and clear, piercing through Ella as if she could see straight into her soul. "You have come seeking answers," the elder said, her voice soft but firm. Ella nodded, unable to find her voice. "You have tampered with forces beyond your understanding, child," the elder continued, her gaze never leaving Ella. "You have brought back the dead, but what you see before you are not your loved ones. They are shadows, echoes of what once was. Their souls are trapped, twisted by the dark magic you used." Ella's heart sank as the elder confirmed what she had feared. "Is there any way to free them?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The elder regarded her for a long moment before speaking. "There is one way, but it is not an easy path. You must destroy the vessels, the bodies they now inhabit. Only then will their souls be released." Ella's breath caught in her throat. Destroy them? The thought of killing her family again, even in their current state, was almost too much to bear. But she knew, deep down, that it was the only way. Will they be at peace?" she asked, her voice trembling. The elder's expression softened, and she nodded. "Yes. Once their bodies are destroyed, their souls will be free to move on to the afterlife." Ella closed her eyes, a wave of relief washing over her. It was not the answer she had wanted, but it was the answer she needed. She thanked the elder and made her way back home, her heart heavy with the burden of what she had to do. When she arrived, her family was waiting for her, standing in the shadows of the doorway. They stared at her with those hollow eyes, their faces blank and expressionless. For a moment, she faltered, her resolve wavering, but then she remembered the elder's words. Steeling herself, Ella drew her sword, the same sword her father had once wielded, and stepped forward. The air was thick with tension as she approached them, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel their eyes on her, watching, waiting. The first strike was the hardest. Her hand trembled as she raised the sword, her vision blurred by tears. But she knew she could not hesitate, could not falter. With a cry of anguish, she brought the sword down, cleaving through the twisted, decaying flesh. Her mother's body crumpled to the ground, and Ella felt a surge of energy as the soul was released, a faint, shimmering light rising from the remains. She could feel her mother's presence for just a moment, a fleeting whisper of gratitude, before it faded into the ether. One by one, she destroyed the vessels, each strike more painful than the last. Her father, her brothers, and finally Kara, her beloved sister. By the time she was done, Ella was on her knees, her body shaking with sobs. The sword slipped from her grasp, clattering to the ground beside her. She had done it. She had freed them. But at what cost? The room was silent now, the only sound the soft crackling of the dying fire. Ella sat there for a long time, her mind numb, her heart hollow. She had lost them all over again, and this time, there was no bringing them back. When she finally rose to her feet, she was a different person. The woman who had left for the battle all those days ago was gone, replaced by someone harder, colder. She gathered what little remained of her family, their ashes, their bones, and carried them to the place where they had once lived. There, in the soft earth of the garden her mother had loved so much, she buried them. She marked each grave with a simple stone, carved with their names. It was a small, humble resting place, but it was all she had left to give. As she stood over the graves, the weight of her actions pressed down on her, threatening to crush her. She had wanted to save them, to undo the horrors of war, but instead, she had only brought more pain, more suffering. The elder's words echoed in her mind, "The dead are not meant to return to the world of the living." She had tried to defy the natural order, and she had paid the price, but as she turned to leave, a single ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the graves. Ella paused, her breath catching in her throat. For the first time since that terrible day on the battlefield, she felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, in freeing their souls, she had also freed herself from the guilt, the anger, the despair that had consumed her. She would never forget her family, never stop loving them, but she knew now that some things were beyond her control. Ella walked away from the graves, her steps slow and measured. She was tired, so very tired, but she knew that her journey was not over. There were others who had suffered as she had, others who needed help. And she would be there for them, just as she had been for her family. She would carry their memory with her, a guiding light in the darkness. And though the pain would never fully fade, she would find a way to move forward, to live in a world without them. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but Ella was ready to face it. She had been to the depths of despair and back, and she had emerged stronger, wiser. She had learned the hard way that life was fragile, precious, and that the dead were best left to rest in peace. As she walked away from the place that had once been her home, Ella felt a sense of closure. She had done what she could, made the best of a terrible situation, and now it was time to move on. And so, with the sun shining down on her, Ella set off into the unknown, her heart heavy with loss but light with the knowledge that she had done what was right. She was a warrior, a survivor, and though the scars of her past would always be with her, she knew she could face whatever the future held.